This is one of the most extreme environments on Earth. For the past 3 years, an intrepid group of South African scientists has pushed the boundary of data collected from the Southern Ocean. Launching ocean gliders off our polar icebreaker, they're doing cutting-edge climate change science.
It's incredibly scary, this little poor thing all on its own in these 10-meter seas.
Dr. Seb Swart, lead scientist of the Southern Ocean Climate and Carbon Observatory, says they've even managed to get the gliders to tweet updates.
Every time we get an update from the glider, it feels like a bit of an Indiana Jones moment.
Half of all human carbon emissions absorbed by the world's oceans are taken up by the Southern Ocean. It's extremely sensitive to climate change, and yet it's also an area of the planet that we know the least about. As part of the natural carbon cycle, the Southern Ocean absorbs and releases CO2 into the atmosphere. However, since the industrial era, the ocean interior has stored 50 times more CO2 than the atmosphere. So if things go out of balance, it'll have a dramatic impact on climate change. Dr. Pedro Montero, head of the Southern Ocean Climate and Carbon Observatory, explains how the largest ocean on the planet functions.
The Southern Ocean is driven by these popularly known as the westerly winds. The westerly winds create a sort of ring of water that circulates around the southern hemisphere, basically. Essentially what you have is this cycle where deep water is brought to the surface by the wind. When it reaches the surface, it outgasses CO2. Further north, phytoplankton take up that CO2, transporting it into the ocean interior.
The plankton acts like a biological pump, taking the CO2 down into the deep ocean. But as the water is warming and getting more acidic due to global warming, combined with stronger winds and storms which are bringing more CO2 to the surface, the plankton can't do its job as effectively.
So basically the strengthening of those westerly winds begins to speed up this flywheel. The speeding up of the flywheel brings up more CO2, but the additional warming related to climate change reduces the primary productivity. The mechanism that brings it up is stronger, but the mechanism that takes it down is weaker. And that's the problem.
We've known this for the last 20 years, but we haven't had sufficiently detailed information on the Southern Ocean to understand this process properly. Ocean robots are beginning to give us that detail.
We understood from ship-based measurements how the ocean varies on a big scale. But what we didn't understand was how did fine-scale dynamics, the weather in the ocean, affect the sensitivity of the ocean to climate and the sensitivity of the climate to the ocean.
Our research vessel, the SAR Gullis 2, is returning home after 3 months in the Southern Ocean and the Antarctic. On board is technology that could help unravel the mysteries around climate change and contribute to the fight to save the planet. But ships are extremely expensive to operate. This polar icebreaker costs about 300,000 rand a day and only spends about 2 weeks of the year, in the summer months, gathering data. Ocean gliders, on the other hand, can be left at sea for up to 6 months at a fraction of the cost. Dr. Seb Swart says the American designers told them that they were crazy when they started out 3 years ago.
2-3 years down the line, we're really starting to see the success of those risky missions that we completed in the Southern Ocean. It's a crazy place to work in, and you know that when we started our program, we were, really scared of what's going to be the next thing that's going to be thrown at us. Some huge storms or ships that we have to avoid. Ice is a big hazard in the Southern Ocean.
In this little lab at the waterfront, they're pioneering a project that is creating a niche in climate change science.
We have 2 different types of gliders. We have ones that profile the ocean. They dive up and down from the surface to 1 kilometer depth. And they have scientific instruments on them that measure the variables that we need to look at to understand what's going on in the science. And then we have a second platform, which we call a wave glider, and that one stays on the surface and gets powered by the waves and moves around and collects data from the surface.
These ocean gliders are revolutionizing climate science and oceanography. Another exciting element is that these 2 craft are being twinned to maximize the data collected from above and beneath the surface.
The atmosphere is interacting with the ocean all the time, and before we didn't really have an idea of how they were behaving together. But now that we have measurements that extend all the way from the ocean to the atmosphere, we can actually see the processes that are happening.
The gliders are remotely controlled from Cape Town, which now boasts some of the best glider pilots in the world who can navigate the most treacherous ocean conditions.
The gliders use satellite communications. They basically call us. The diving glider, for example, takes about 5 hours to do a dive, and when it comes to the surface again, it finds its connection with a satellite, phones us, gives us its data, and we give it back signals and commands that actually change what the glider does.
And it's not only ice and strong currents they have to navigate. The coastal waters are filled with large container ships and fishing vessels that could easily mow them down.
The gliders are intelligent enough to actually tell us where the ships are. They have a sensor called an AIS, which detects where the ships are and therefore track where the ships are moving in accordance to where our glider is and avoid them accordingly.
The ship can also only work in the summer months for about 2 weeks, but these gliders are working 6 months at a time, so they're getting a much more detailed picture.
Here we have a shot of actually what is the temperature that the gliders measured between the surface ocean and to 1 kilometer depth. So this is a complete picture of just that one glider observing the temperature of the ocean.
The scientific holy grail is to gather information from the Southern Ocean in winter. These wave gliders will be deployed from Cape Town for that very purpose, and they'll take about a month to get there.
Getting data in the winter periods is really important to understanding the full seasonal scale elements of the science and the research. Winter observations in the Southern Ocean until now have been either very difficult or impossible.
It's clear these guys get really attached to their gliders, tracking them day in and day out as they travel all alone in the massive ocean. Initially, the gliders all had names like Pinky, the Brain and Vader, but that clouded the scientists' objectivity, so they're back to simply being numbers.
That's glider 542 that actually has been in the Antarctic for the last 3 months, and you can see spatially where it's been sampling. And then about 2 weeks ago, we needed it to go a little bit further south to intercept the ship, so that when the ship came, it was in the right location for the ship to grab it out of the Southern Ocean and take it back home.
And it's a whole lot easier said than done. Intern Kagiso Mbete never imagined the weather could ever get that bad.
The first time we tried to deploy the wave glider, it actually hit back on the ship. And then we tried again, and then the next time it went fine, because we had like 8-meter swells and the boat was swinging and rolling. Yeah, it was a mess.
The latest spin-off from the investment team to developing the gliders is to use them for fish surveys in conjunction with fisheries research vessels. However, the fisheries vessels haven't gone to sea for the last few years after former Fisheries Minister Tina Joemat-Petersen handed them over to the Navy. One of the great things about the gliders is that you can almost guarantee that they'll be in the ocean, unlike the ships.
We have had some problems in getting our research vessels back online after the fiasco we had with the decommissioning earlier.
Fisheries scientist Janet Kutsia says the fish surveys are expensive, costing about 50 million rand a survey, and so they happen infrequently.
What we don't know is what's happening between surveys. So advantage of using gliders is that they can be out there in the ocean continuously and can be monitored from your office.
They can also be used to detect illegal fishing vessels in our waters. So the idea is to release hundreds of gliders into the ocean, linking to hundreds of satellites, which will inevitably generate mega data. The CSIR has acquired supercomputers to translate all this data into accessible information, one of which is its Earth system model.
One of the things that we'll be doing with our Earth systems model is not just understanding how changes in the Southern Ocean affect global CO2 and global climate, but how that translates into regional climate.
This ocean glider project in the Southern Ocean is so unique that it's created a niche for South Africa in the global understanding of climate change. Up until recently, the oceanic contribution to carbon emission wasn't even factored into the models of climate change. Now, for the first time, it'll be part of the climate change talks.
The real power is in bringing the gliders, the supercomputer, the high-resolution models in the supercomputer, the ships, and the satellites together. And we're doing that as a South African interdisciplinary team to bring a unique contribution, actually, something that's different to what other institutions globally are doing. And that's going to be our contribution to the next global assessment of climate, which is in 2019.
If we don't understand what impacts the warming climate is having on the Southern Ocean and do something to stop it, when the CO2 flywheel starts speeding up, it's going to be impossible to stop.
The influence of the ocean climate is still going to emerge in a much stronger way in the second half of the century. So we want to understand these dynamics now so that our descendants in the second half of the century are actually in a position, to make better decisions than the one we have.